And welcome, our performers. Thank you very much for coming today. We're in Sydney again recording another live webinar with a small crew of people here that have joined us to engage with our guest Stewart, who I'll introduce in a moment. Thanks for everyone spending their, for most of you in Australia, your lunch breaks engaging with us and getting involved in these conversations about career management and particularly topics that are relevant to the successes a finance leader in the current day and age. Just for some context for anyone new to our environment and new to the Outperformer, we run these webinars with people like Stewart, CFOs, executive subject matter experts, on topics and from the perspective of getting some real, genuine life scenarios and situations where we can actually take real learning to the table. We find that instead of going to textbooks and lectures and Google for our answers, when you get the chance to get into the headspace of leaders who have been through challenges, been through scenarios that are relevant to what we're going through in our own jobs, we get a lot more out of it. And we're really gracious to have the great speakers that we bring on board who are not only prepared to tell the glossy solution and story, but also delve into some of the challenges and the real life impacts of decisions, challenges and issues they've been through. So I tend to refer to it as standing on the shoulders of giants. We do a lot of work with mentors who are working directly with many of our members to support them with career decisions and different challenges they're working through. And this is just a way of standing on another giant's shoulders in a more general platform where we can touch many people, learn from the experiences of these executives and naturally get ahead where we can. But enough from me. I've got the pleasure of introducing Stewart Cummins, who is an experienced CFO and CEO of very large, complex businesses and has plenty to share on the topic that we've chosen today, which is on what we're calling expecting the unexpected, plan A, B, C and D. And as I'm sure most of the people online and everyone here in the room would appreciate, we're in environments where there are many complex decisions being made. We've got multiple facets to decisions that we need to take into account. And naturally there's a lot of human pressure as much as financial and number pressure that comes into decision making. So today we're going to try and get into Stewart's head and experience and use some case studies from his own story to help us illustrate some of the themes and principles that he uses in his work. So without me telling your entire story, Stewart, first of all, thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate having you.
It's an absolute pleasure, Brad. One of the things I enjoy when I meet advisors, people like Brad, is that they'll give you a new little kind of phrase that you can use. And different phrases I've heard before about jumping on a fast-moving train or those kind of things. So now I've got standing on the shoulder of a giant. Is that it?
That is right. It comes from Isaac Newton years ago. The theory was that the small people would stand on the giant to be able to see the horizon, know where they're going. But
I love it.
Exactly. Well, I think it works, and it really suits what we're all about. But just to get the ball rolling, Stuart, can you just share a really quick snapshot on your career? Because there's a lot of context that we'll get from your career journey.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about where you've been, and we'll go into the topic from there?
Okay. Well, let me start with perhaps the basics in terms of went to Macquarie University, graduated, became a chartered accountant through the institute, and first job out of uni was as an auditor with Arthur Andersen. And so that proved quite prescient with what I would do in future years, because some of the audit clients that I was assigned to were, shall we say, troubled companies. And let me give you a couple of examples. That one of them was FAI insurance, another one was HIH insurance. And then another one was a company called TUI's and Lion Nathan, which was a whole lot more fun than those other two. But that was just after the Bond brewing days, and so it was, having had Alan Bond owning the business, it was then quite a tumultuous kind of a period as that business moved forwards. So got my stripes there, learnt the basics, and then went out into the big wide world of corporate Australia and have worked for a number of different organisations such as Caltex, such as TNT and Transpacific, a few other companies that we'll perhaps touch upon through the conversation today. But it would be fair to say, with the benefit now of 25 odd years of doing this kind of stuff, that I've probably got a few scars and a few battle wounds, which actually prompted one of my good friends to say to me one day, he said, "Stu, mate," he said, "have you seen The Hurt Locker?" And I'm saying, "Right, where's this going, Al?" And he said, "Well, you're like that guy in The Hurt Locker, except you don't wear the suits." And I'm going, okay, so I defuse bombs. But again, I mean, to come back to point, it's where I suppose I've had some opportunities and some experience. Some of it I wouldn't wish on anyone, but in other senses, it's been fun and it's really grown me as a person, and I'm very different to what I was 25 years ago.
Well, after those scars, I think you might be a little bit different, but this is the point of standing on the shoulders of giants. You do learn from the scars. It's where all the magic is made. So we're going to get right into the topic, and you did highlight a couple of companies that you've worked for. We won't get you to go into them in complete detail. But one of the things you've done across your career is whole of business change. You've been involved in organisations that really need to transform. And I'm keen for you to take us through how you actually drive key decisions in an environment where there is significant change, and just a scenario to help illustrate some of the principles that you apply.
Okay. Perhaps if I could use Caltex, which is probably the best example that I can give you about a whole of business change. And date-wise, this goes back a little bit because I want to talk to you about my responsibility for implementing the GST. And so that was of itself 17, 18 years ago, and I'll be the first one to admit tax is not my most favourite topic. It's something that obviously you need to have a mastery of to a point, but the key thing that when I was given the poisoned chalice at the time by CFO of Caltex that I'm really good friends with, and he was actually doing me a huge favour, because what he was saying was, I need you to actually help me with a business challenge, because we're going to need to change how we do business with all of our customers and all of our suppliers, and it touches on everything. And what I probably didn't appreciate at the outset was how the skills that I learned in terms of having to deal with some of the corporate PR communications people became really pivotal with how I've then taken forwards my communication style, whether that's writing documents or delivering presentations, etc. And so just to give you an illustration of, there was a huge amount of influencing of people, because there's a limit to, you don't want to be seen to be the combative one that says, you've got to do this. It's trying to help to bring the horse to water. And it was so multifaceted, because it was everything from how we're going to change the petrol price out the front on the pump, to changing the price on every single item of food and grocery in the shop, as well as the impact on the franchisees, the distributors, and probably one of my least favourite but most proud moments was dealing with the ACCC. And in a sense winning, because they came on fairly hot and heavy against the company, and we had to explain ourselves. And so that was learning to deal with a regulator, a very substantial regulator that had a really strong interest in understanding what we did and how we did it, was really challenging. Because, for instance, if Claire had said to you, well, you've got to change the price, you're responsible for the petrol price in Perth. And so you've made the adjustment and you've taken off the old tax and you put on the new tax. But then what did you tell the person next to you? Or what did you tell? And that was the kind of situation. It's where we were rock solid with being able to do the first step. You got it down right, did it all right. But then it was the Chinese whispers that transpired from there that became quite a challenge. So, for me to be able to influence people, which meant there was a lot of time sitting in meeting rooms like this to actually share with them, what are we trying to do, how much time have we got to do it. And that was part of the difficult thing, is that the deadline didn't change, and we had 7 or 8 different point of sale devices that we had to change to put the record the tax and call it a tax invoice. And it just became absolutely diabolical, the kind of challenges that we came across. So that was certainly pretty challenging to influence so many different stakeholders.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm sure everyone in the room and anyone online, we're all in environments that are going through a lot of change, and stakeholders are consistently, whether you call it a battle or something we need to work through. But they're certainly key to our change management right now. But if you consider also at the time, there's significant layers of decision making, and I'd imagine from a decision and risk analysis point of view, potentially before some of those implementations were played out, you needed to look at scenarios and needed to break them down. How did you do that?
We got most things, we didn't get all things. And let me share with you one example. I mentioned the point of sale devices. And unfortunately, unlike today where you can just get out your iPhone and just hit update, unfortunately that wasn't how it worked back in those days with point of sale devices. And so what we had to do was send out technicians to plug in something into the machine in the service station around, I think it was 1,000 different locations. And so the technician went out, he did that. But if you think about it, we couldn't do all of those 1,000 service station visits on the night of the 30th of June. We had to send them out some weeks. In fact, it was about 2.5 months in advance. And everyone was very proud. We'd done all of the design right, and we knew what the changes were, and it was all coded and tested and to the umpteenth. What we didn't appreciate was we said, well, that's okay, it'll start spitting out receipts that say GST. But it says 0, so you know that you haven't been charged GST. But that was not smart. And so that was where one of the things that we learnt, and we're kind of going, hang on a minute, we missed that, we didn't anticipate that, because then we had the ACCC knocking on the door saying, you've started implementing GST and applying it before the days. And so we had to explain to them, oh, well, actually, it's all okay. We're not charging GST, but here's the logistics of what we needed to do. And I suppose the challenge there was we'd been so task-focused about getting all of the service stations updated in time, getting all of the coding done, making sure that everyone was happy with what sequence it looked like on the receipt, because believe it or not, there is an art to designing a good-looking receipt that comes out of a point-of-sale device. So we'd gone through all of that, and we were so preoccupied with that, we actually missed it. And that's where we'd kind of thought about it and said, but that's all right, because there's no tax and it says 0, so Blind Freddy can see they haven't been charged that. But that didn't stop the complaints from customers, as well as, in fact, from ACCC.
Yeah, wow. What did you learn from that experience? What would you have done differently?
We would have actually produced sooner some notices to put at the point of sale. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I made the comment about doing a lot in the communication space, what I would have done in hindsight was produced a little sheet of paper that we could have given to customers when they got their receipts. Mm-hmm. And that could have been a bit more demonstrable to show that, this is changing, this is why it's changing, but you're not being charged GST yet.
Yeah, great. The scenario there, and if you think about scenarios you've approached in the future, have there been any that you've gone, look, if I look at that scenario and the way I had to approach it, or why I should have approached it potentially, what are some of the key themes that you've taken away from that for the future?
Well, I think it's the importance of needing time to actually review what you're doing, and to actually explicitly say to yourself, and for there to be a team conversation, because it's where it's sometimes me alone, I'm just not going to be able to identify and spot some of these things. Whereas if we sit down in a room like this, Esther's going to say to me, have you thought about this? And I go, that's a damn good idea. I totally hadn't thought of that. And so I think that the power of mobilising the team to be talking about it and thinking about it is really critical.
Absolutely. We're going to move on from that case, and it might come up in some few further questions from the group. But I do want to talk about now the sort of the what if scenario analysis piece, and again going back to some large scale, poison chalice. I don't know if this is another one, but another scenario where it has been complex, and you've needed to look at different alternatives, and actually then start to look at that plan A, B, C, D concept that we're talking about today. Can you talk about that in a case that might reflect that?
So let me talk to you about perhaps two different dimensions of this, Brad, and I hope that I'm going to address what you're kind of looking for here.
Absolutely.
I'll give you two different scenarios. One is what I'll say more of a disaster or emergency type situation, which was about 3 years ago. It was almost 3 years ago to this month. I was working for Transpacific, and that is a waste management company. They operate a large truck fleet, and so they're collecting waste all over the country. And there had been a very bad accident in Adelaide. In fact, it was a double fatality. And the difficult thing about that particular set of circumstances was that it was not an accident in a way that any of us had ever dreamt of, which was that 2 people died and 2 members of the public died, which was pretty distressing, for a company that prides itself on being a safe and responsible business. The tough part of it was that straight after that happened, the Comcare, which is the federal workplace workers' comp type regulator, straight away called the company up, and they said to us, we're aware of this accident and we're not sure that any of your trucks are safe. So from that minute onwards, I think it was a Tuesday afternoon, something like that, we had the whole business, 3,000 trucks, 4,000, whatever it was, off the roads, and we were not allowed to trade, and we couldn't recommence operations for between 2 and 14 days. Now, the reason I use this to illustrate is that we'd done, and with the companies I've worked at in the past, you do all of this kind of stuff. You sit in rooms like this and you say, what could go wrong? And what we didn't appreciate, we'd done, certainly done what ifs, if there was a single incident, and even in saying that we had a double fatality, it was the ripple effect where it suddenly shut down the whole business. And importantly, if I put the pure finance view of this on the table, it's where we had more than adequate cash contingency to be able to keep running at 100% costs and 0% revenue. Now, that learning from that incident, I knew that we were safe and we weren't going to financially be ruined at that point. The total cost of the incident, leave aside the loss of life, which was of itself very distressing, in excess of $20 million. And that was where, put that to you, go back to your businesses, and when you think about, is there a set of circumstances that could unfold that mean that cash buffer, and this is why I've used this particular situation many, many times subsequently, is to say, you're just running too tight. And you have to ask the question, what if there was a set of circumstances, how long could you last? And so that is a really powerful question to think about. how much cash have we got if nothing else? I mean, sure, we kept on getting our debtors paid, but we weren't actually generating any new revenue. And so that was a fast moving situation. And it was interesting, and don't want to go on too long here, Brad, but that also was a really big challenge for the business and the management team, because when we did our debrief afterwards, we did all of the right things. Everyone went to their assigned responsibilities of who was dealing with external regulators and media, who was doing with the internal. Where we abjectly fell down was fatigue management. And my point there was that we had some people that were working 24, 48 hours straight in response to the situation, because the incident happened at about 2 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I mean, I was one of them. Everyone worked all night. Everyone worked all the next day. And we actually did send certain people home. And it's where I kind of got onto the program probably a bit too late, but we should have had a much better fatigue management plan to be able to respond, because otherwise we were creating further risk in trying to respond to the first issue. So that's probably a fairly look. You guys might say, well, that's never going to happen to me. So let me give you perhaps a more practical kind of a what if. Sometimes you've got to sell a business or sell an asset, and the what if that I'd put to you, and this is very much where plan A, B, C, D comes into it, it's basically what happens if your first option evaporates. You've got to be able to go to the second or the third or the fourth. And that's again something that I've found over the years. There's a company I'm working with at the moment. We've got 4 plans, A, B, C, D. Surprise, surprise. Plan B fell over at about 9 o'clock yesterday morning. So now we've got A, C and D. And the question the board asked this morning is there a plan E that we need to think about? And that's the kind of thing that, as finance executives, you've got to be looking, yes, at the numbers and what are the financial outcomes under different scenarios, but you've also got to be creative and looking and saying, as part of the management team contributing to the conversation, it's not all on your shoulders about that giants and stuff, yes. But it is really important that as the stewards of the organisation's resources, it's really important that you know that there are backup plans, because otherwise you're putting your eggs in one basket. And that's where, to be honest, no one is going to thank you if it stuffs up and you hadn't have thought what the backup plan was.
So when you come through these plans, you've got A, B, C, D, you might even get to E, and then you could iterate that over time as you work through some major challenges. How do you avoid overwhelming a group of leaders in a room who are all trying to digest plan A and maybe B, and you are taking them obviously on the journey as a finance leader or CEO?
Yeah, so that's where I come back to my comment about needing good communication. So that's where generally, and there is an art to this, there is an art to being able to write, let's say, a board paper or a discussion paper without putting too many words on the page. And one of the things that I've learned and seen over the years is if you draft, and let's say it's a media release, if it's drafted, often it can be quite verbose. And when you send it off to the PR advisor, for the PR advisor to do what they're paid to do, one of the things that they do is they just look at, can they shorten the sentences, can they take words out? And the point here is that in the same way with a media release, it's the exact same for a discussion paper or a board paper or some kind of document that's being laid in front of the management team, that there's, again, you can't have no words. You can't have too many words, and it's really about making it really crisp and clear. Now, one of the tricks that I've done before, and this could say something about my personality and my sense of humour, but, and I might warn, I actually also use this sometimes as interview questions, is that I'll actually try and personify the plan by calling it an animal or a mineral or a vegetable. So just so you know, the interview question is, if you had to be an animal, mineral or vegetable, what would you be? So, but that's where I find that, and the obvious one, when I was at TNT, I was the finance director at TNT, and the management team was struggling to really be able to talk about strategy. Because, it was funny. The sales director said to me, oh, that's that stuff that James comes in and talks about, and he kind of whiteboards it, and I just fall asleep. And I said, Mark, look at it this way. And I said, one strategy is like a box of assorted chocolates, and that's where you try and be a bit of everything. Or you might have another strategy which is just plain dairy milk chocolate, or it might be something else. And so he was then able to go, I'm the sales director, am I selling all of the same thing, or am I trying to sell all of these different coloured chocolates? And so that's where you've got to find what suits the situation.
Yes.
To be able to find something that your audience is going to respond to. And, for instance, I worked for a boss once that was big into US baseball. So he was a Red Sox fan, so you could try and find something that is going to be the communication tool, and that helps the people that you're interacting with to be able to differentiate, and it's where they say, I like that one, not that one.
Absolutely. And then that's it, analogies or stories around things that we can all resonate with just simplify the message so much, and particularly when you're dealing with quite complex scenarios.
Look, I think it's good because it helps. Let's face it, we're all finance people that are good at numbers. So what I think is really great is to be able to demonstrate that you've got a bit of personality and you can actually think creatively and interact in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to move on a little bit now to the concept of walking into a very challenged environment. You've done
the hurt locker.
The hurt locker. For anyone that's on the call or in the room here, there might be stages of your career where it is the right thing to do to walk into a very challenging opportunity. It could be a lot of learning, a lot of development. It could actually turn into one of the best career moves you've ever made. And I've seen that a lot over the years, and I've also seen people that have needed to clean up a mess. But can you take us through a scenario where you've done that, you've needed to look at the various motivations of different people to drive them through a change, and what that involved?
Certainly, and probably the best recent example I could talk to is that about 2.5 years ago I was engaged as the interim CFO of a company called Vocation. Now, Vocation was a newly IPO'd education provider, and they'd fallen into some difficulties, to put it fairly mildly, that they'd had basically problems with the government, with the contract, because the government was the primary source of funds for their education services, and the government stopped funding them because they had been alleged to have done some naughty things. And the knock-on of that was the share price got hammered, and it went from a market cap of $750 million to about 20. And surprise, surprise, the banks weren't happy. And so to give you literally my first day on the job with that company, that the chairman at the time, fantastic guy, he took me into a meeting with the banks. And I walked out afterwards and I said, you told me the banks were pissed off. You didn't tell me that they were ready to rip my spine out. It's like, yeah, the bank's not happy. So that's where I suppose that was the anecdote of where you walk into a situation and you might have a somewhat of an understanding of what you might expect, and what you need to do, I've found, is on a day-by-day basis, and particularly in those first few days, make sure that you get in contact with all of the key stakeholders. And so in this instance, that meant the bank's number one, the government number two, yes, to an extent, some shareholders. Very early on was actually needing to deal with the media. And so again, that was where, it was actually 2 days ago, one of my mates said to me, I hadn't seen him for about probably too long, 5 years or so, and he said, oh yeah, I'd heard you on Ross Greenwood Drive on 2GB. Like, yeah, that was probably not my happiest day. Ross was an absolute gentleman, but the subject we had to talk about was not a great one, which was, what are we doing about this company that has, its share price has fallen 98%, and it had a lot of staff, a hell of a lot of students. We had about 10 or 15,000 students that were at risk of being thrown out of their course. So again, to kind of look at the picture of some fairly interesting stakeholder groups that had to be managed. And the most important thing in those kind of situations is prioritising what's got to happen, because it's where you very quickly end up with a to-do list that's like pages and pages long. But what you need to do, I mean, realistically, there's 3, 4 or 5 things that you can probably manage at any one point in time. I often say that to my staff, and I just say, guys, how many fingers have you got on your hand? And most of us have got 5. It's like, well, actually, don't give me any more than 5 things that you're trying to do. And it just helps to focus people. And importantly with that, I had those external stakeholders, but the thing that became fairly clear very quickly was the staff were really rattled, because they thought they'd done something wrong, and most of them hadn't, but they were fearful of their jobs. And so we had to talk regularly, and typically we'd have a weekly meeting in the lunchroom to talk about what was going on. And there were limits to what you couldn't say, but being able to give them the opportunity to ask whatever questions that they wanted. And that's, look, it was a pretty extreme situation, but by the same token, you've got to be open and honest. And I've certainly found that, if you're at least going to have a conversation and open yourself up as a leader to have a conversation, that's a hell of a lot better than avoiding it and just hiding behind closed doors.
Absolutely, and I think in such a difficult time, there's that anxiety and fear that comes with any change, and in this case, a fairly significant one. It wasn't a standard transformation; it was survival. So you've shared with me in the past this concept of playing poker when you're in these sorts of situations, where you're dealing with a board, you're dealing with all of these different stakeholders, and you need to know when to play the right card or hold, and how to communicate the right information at the right time. Can you share with the audience just some theory around that and how you attack it? So
I think, Brad, the thing that's got to be appreciated is that humans are human, and it's important, again, as much as having a grasp of the numbers, which is what we are all expected to do, it's important as you refine your skills as a finance executive to also be able to, look, not perfectly, but to try and read the situation and to anticipate what someone may or may not do. And as much as that something might happen and there might be a particular development, it's a really healthy conversation to be having with your team to be talking about this has happened and that's fine, but what's really going on here? And that can be where, for instance, let's assume that, again, we're in some kind of a negotiation situation and there's a meeting that's been scheduled and suddenly the other party tries to change the rules. And the point about the poker and being a good poker player is you want to try and figure out what's really going on. Is that person trying to actually play a game? Are they trying to undermine your negotiating position? Should you still go ahead with that, or should you change tactics? And this is, real life. This is what happened yesterday. My plan B party basically tried to change the rules, and we talked about it as a team. And the three of us that were involved, we said, we actually don't like the look of that. We think the guy's playing poker, and I think he's a pretty good player, actually. So I said, let's pull back. And so that's what we did. And I think that it's where, again, you're not always going to be right with these situations. Was it the right thing for us to pull back? Will we be able to re-engage at some point? I don't know. But what I do know is that we've assessed the financial outcomes of Plan A, Plan C, Plan D, and we're okay to park B for a while. And so that's really where, again, there's the forest and the trees, and it's important as finance executives to be able to be talking to your management team, and often it's your running mate, that if it's Brad and I that have got to negotiate something or do something, we've got to be really in lockstep and be trying to read what's going on the other side.
And do you find, obviously having that running partner or anyone else involved in the deal, it's important to have their input, but do you find over time if you become a better poker player?
So I'll answer that by sharing with you a situation that probably about 10 or so years ago, I was working at TNT. The Director of Operations and I went over to New Zealand to meet with a supplier. And it was basically a 3-hour meeting. And we had a break at the halfway point. And out in the corridor, my colleague said to me, I know we agreed to play good cop, bad cop, but I didn't know you were going to play really, really bad cop.
So you can be the bad cop, can you? She's such a nice guy, Stuart.
So it was just that kind of really made me laugh. And well, actually, it wasn't deliberate. Am I playing too hard? It's like, no, it's good. It's working. That's
good. Look, guys in the room, obviously, if you've got any questions, I'm going to start to talk about some more theoretical, practical takeaways and some things that will probably involve some more stories as well from Stewart. But if you do have anything, please let me know. And I might just start off with talking about one of the conversations that we've had as well around the 4 Ps. And what that means, and then if you were in the audience, how would you apply these 4 Ps that you live by?
So the embarrassing thing I need to admit here, Brad, is I probably can't count because actually it's 5 Ps.
It is 5 Ps, isn't it? You call it 4. We talked about 4 for about 6 weeks. There you go.
So proper planning prevents poor performance. So it's nothing that I invented. I gladly stole it in the same way that you've got your giants and what have you. And it's something that I just think that that's really important for me, and it's something that I try and encourage with my staff. That look, again, you've got to be sensible. So it's where sometimes 80-20 or 70-30 is good enough, but it's where it does help if someone's, for instance, being asked to write a board paper. Then let's talk about what the scope of that is going to be, and the person that might be asked to write that board paper is going to do a hell of a better job if you can actually spend the time and sit down with them, talk about the context, talk about what the real purpose of that board paper is. Importantly, talk about the quality of it. Talk about the quantity. Do we want a 2-page board paper? Do we want a 20-page board paper? Talk about the resources. Are they allowed to get some help with writing the board paper? But very importantly, the schedule. So that's where, okay, the board paper's due by the 3rd week of next month, then perhaps we should agree that we'll sit down 2 weeks out from that and review a draft. Now, I'm quite particular with just going through those context, purpose, etc. Because again, this was something that I learned from an engineer that I work with at Caltex, that he'd used to work for a company called Adelaide Bryson. And at Adelaide Bryson, they had some kind of management textbook that talked about a CPQQRS, which I've got to say is the worst acronym I've ever heard of. But the point here is that it's just a simple 1-page template that he used, and now I use, and now my staff use, to be able to help. And you can use it in a number of different situations to set the guidelines for a project. It just helps to be able to define the scope of what needs to be done.
Absolutely. And is CMP, I'm assuming, is context and purpose?
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, it's fun. It's interesting you talk about context and purpose when it comes to any project. It's also very important to consider when it comes to career planning, career management.
Yep.
We talk about this when we have conversations, whether it's to do with a future employer, whether it comes to our own decision making. If a lot of the time we make decisions without understanding the purpose, making decisions based on what's in front of us at the time and what feels right at the time, and the purpose and the outcome we're trying to achieve might disappear in the confusion and the mess. So we see that a lot. But moving on a little bit in terms of career management, one of the things that we talk about is this concept of internal locus of control. So people that are managing their career very well tend to be what we call internalisers. They look at what they can take control of and achieve within the context of the environment and the decisions they can make. Now, you've got a philosophy around expecting the unexpected, and that means something that is important to behaving and being a leader, whether it be in finance or I think in any field.
Yep.
What's your philosophy to that?
So you're probably going to sense with how I respond to this question that, again, it's something in my personality that I look at different reference sources for ideas about how to manage. And there is, it might be The Hunt for Red October, the movie, another movie. It's a bit more palatable than Hurt Locker, I've got to say. Not quite as much blood and guts. But I'm pretty sure that Sean Connery, who's another icon, is very determined and very decisive and helps the sailors in the sub to know, in the face of some kind of drama, what they had to do. And I hope I'm doing the movie justice and the situation justice. It's where what doesn't look good as a leader is for you to stand up the front when something goes pear-shaped and go, oh shit, I don't know what we should do now. It's where what your staff want you to do is to be able to convey just a sensation that you are in control. It might be that you need to take a break or somehow gather your thoughts. And I'm not saying here to fabricate or to lie, but it's just really important that people look to leaders, and that's where, ideally things happen and you can say, I have thought about that, and that's kind of something that I thought might happen. But if it's a situation that is totally left field, then your staff still want to know what's going to happen and what you're going to do about it. And in order to have a conversation with them, you can use them to help to formulate what's the best idea, but I just think that it's really important that you need to compose yourself, and it can be difficult. because I'm pretty sure that there's wiring between the front part of your brain and the middle part of your brain that actually can sometimes make you want to just run like crap. But it's where there is an important responsibility as a finance executive for us to be able to help to manage a situation and to evaluate options, and to be able to help facilitate what's the best outcome or the least worst outcome in the circumstances.
Absolutely. And you're paid for that, right? It's that anticipation. You think that's what...
Look, this is where people don't thank you for doing all of the extra thinking that this kind of stuff involves, but they're sure as hell not going to appreciate if you just don't do it. If you come forwards in a point of crisis or at a time of need, then that's fantastic, and that's how you distinguish yourself from everyone else that doesn't actually do that work and doesn't do that thinking. And so that's where I come back to the 5 Ps about proper planning, that really can make a big difference.
Absolutely. Guys in the room, or obviously anyone online, feel free to jot down a note, and I'd be very happy to ask Stewart. But in the room, is there anyone that has a question for Stewart?
Maybe I'll just ask, thanks for your sharing. I think it's really good. And I thought my job is really hard, but I think to manage fertilities and then when the share price dropped like 98%, I think that probably is quite difficult. Can I ask, in that situation, the vocational company, if you can review what happened to the company and then what you have done as a head of finance to influence, but I'm sure there's other stakeholders in the company, like the CEO, the board members, the lead management, and what capabilities yet in your financial area that you had influence.
I might just repeat. I just might repeat that for everyone online. Essentially, the fallout and the byproduct of the situations at Vocation. So, what happened, and how did Stewart tackle that with people?
Yep. So the short answer is that the company actually went into voluntary administration, and then it actually went into liquidation. So that was a pretty confronting situation for everyone concerned. That the previous CEO and CFO had both left the business by that stage. I was engaged initially as the interim CFO, and then the board, basically through necessity, asked me to become the CEO. So it was not really merit-based. There was hardly a competition. It was kind of like, gee, who else are we going to coerce to do this? So that's where we took the business over a period of just under 12 months, in fact, and it's where the eventual outcome was that it went under, but what we were able to do was sell off businesses in the normal course. We were able to sell it in such a way that probably proves I am a reasonable poker player. We sold them for full book value, one of them above book value, in spite of it being seen as a fire sale. And what that did was it meant that when the company eventually went down, instead of having about 15,000 students dislocated, it was about 3,000 to 4,000. It meant that the staff, which had peaked at about 600, there were about 100 and something staff that were affected. And importantly, that we were able to also repay about 98 or 99% of the bank debt. And the final thing, which gets to your point about, well, what happened to the directors? 3 of the directors walked away, heads held high, and have got a clean bill of health from ASIC. 2 of them are being prosecuted in the federal court, and I won't say anything more about it. So that's where the consequences can be pretty severe, and it was a very difficult situation, but it was still a privilege for me to be asked to help that company, because it's where as a result of that, it's not a great thing to have on your CV, to be honest, but I've got some pretty happy people in different quarters of the business community that at least say, well, it wasn't your fault, you came in to try and fix it, and you did everything you could to get it to the best state. Perfect world would have been that it didn't go under and we could have done something else, but the final impact was far less than what it could have been. And at the end of the day, I say to myself, job done is within constraints.
Absolutely. I think, a fantastic outcome considering the situation. Any more questions from the room? I certainly have another one.
I hope you've prepped me.
So, one of the things that you and I have talked about before is, you've had some challenging situations, challenging scenarios. You don't always have the answer, and sometimes even in the room, from your team, you won't have the answer. When is it right to, and you use this term, the Eddie Maguire call, right? When you phone a friend and talk to a mentor, and how have you, probably the secondary component to that is, how have you developed those sorts of mentors and the right people around you to be able to call on?
So let me perhaps take a step back in the process. One of the things that I think is really important for a finance executive is being able to actually define what the problem is really, really simply. Because sometimes there's a lot of things going on, and when your staff might sit down with you and they say, this has happened, it's really important to be rock solid, crystal clear, and I use this kind of analogy, elevator pitch style, one sentence, two sentences, tell me what the problem is, and that helps to then think about what are we going to do about it. And the relevance then of what we're going to do about it, sometimes collectively we don't have the answers and we don't have the ability and the resources to be able to address it. But sometimes we need to call on Eddie Maguire. So we need to phone a friend or find a lifeline to help the situation. And my point here is that I think that we've all had situations where, for instance, if there's a role, there's a particular role that that role is perfect for such and such. And so it might be that either you can call up that person and encourage them to leave where they are and come and work for you, or when you're briefing the recruitment consultant, you can say to them, I need someone like that. So see what you can do. And it's where, look, it takes time and it takes years that you get to know people, and you can see how they can help in different situations. And that's where, again, coming back to the concept of needing to prioritise, if there is something that's pretty bad that happens, or that you have a resource need and you need to try and get an answer, then I'll call Harry. And Harry says, well, I don't know who, I don't have someone, but why don't you talk to the next person? And that's how it goes. And I just think that, again, as finance executives, it's important for us to help the business to define the problem. And typically we're the ones that have got best access to a lot of the information, both financial and statistical. And that can help us to be able to work with fellow managers to be able to solve the problem.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things you talked about there is that situation of even being able to define the problem to the other people that you're talking to. You talked about recruiters, and this is just on the access of talent. Being able to say someone like that is actually it makes very clear reference for anyone else that you're dealing with when it comes to attraction of talent. Yep. Do you find that's a strategy you use all the time when you are trying to attract talent? Picture who you want, picture who you've worked with before, and consider consider someone like that?
Look, sometimes yes. I think the thing that's important is, and again, no one's perfect with this, but sometimes it's actually the candidate that's not the one that you expect that turns out to be the perfect match. But I think that, again, to use my example of the box of chocolates, that sometimes if you can actually tell the business partner or the recruitment partner that you want a mixed, whatever, it helps if you can say that you want someone that's like George Clooney, or you want someone like something else, to be able to, give them a read on the kind of person for the role.
Absolutely. As we're starting to run out of time, I've just got one more question from online, but is there anything else in the room? Sounds like everyone's had a good chance. You probably kept them thinking.
You've exhausted me, Brad.
But there is a good question from someone online. Bill online has said, focus is on planning ahead in order to be prepared. How important do you believe it is to stop and reflect when you've been through a difficult situation?
Can I perhaps try and tackle that question two ways, in two different elements? Firstly, in terms of the focus on planning, I think it's really good to try and make sure that you have always keep a degree of horizon in front of you, so that again, with the expect the unexpected, so that you can at least have a window of what's happening in the next 1, 2, 3 months. Now, sometimes you might need to plan a little bit further out, but I think that is a good kind of rule of thumb. And for the same reason that the single most important thing that any finance executive should ever see every day of the week is the cash, and know how much cash you got, and be thinking about, well, where are we going to be in 3 months' time? In terms of the reflection and really looking back and thinking about what went well, what didn't go well, it can be a difficult and confronting thing. It's where you can do self-reflection whenever you want. Obviously, you can kind of, and people do it different ways. What I encourage my staff to do is, for instance, after a meeting or a particular project, that we might actually do some kind of debrief. And the way that it was taught to me was, it's called a deltas and gammas exercise. And the delta is, what should we change? What perhaps didn't go as well as it could? And now that we know a bit more, that we would change, what are the gammas, what are the strengths? What don't we want to change? What was really, really good? And I think that gammas and deltas exercise is a really important one to be able to encourage an open conversation and an honest conversation. So that's where sometimes I'll do those deltas and gammas, for instance, after we might have had a 1 day or a 2 day management meeting, that you will see some boards of directors actually assign responsibility for one of the directors to do it at the end of each board meeting. And that's, look, not all boards do it, but it is seen to be a good practice or a best practice. I also, I suppose, adopted in terms of, and this again comes back to my 5 Ps, for meeting plans, that it's important that if you're going to have a meeting, and it's a meeting that is of a reasonable level of importance, then I think it's good to have a meeting plan, and it's good to have, therefore, a purpose, have the key messages and how you're going to navigate the meeting, have the exit criteria so that you can actually say the meeting is over when, and you actually think about when's the meeting over. To come back then to answering this question is, after the meeting's over, it's great to actually do a meeting debrief and to actually say, well, that was the purpose, this is what we were trying to do, did we actually achieve it or not? And so that's where how often or not you do it is going to be a function of circumstance. It certainly doesn't need to be done all of the time, but I think that it's a really healthy kind of a practice because, again, we're all trying to improve, and it's where I've had some skeptics at the outset that say, oh, you know, let's be honest, they think it's bullshit that they've got to write a meeting plan. But then when you actually go through it, and the person that was probably most sceptical was my tax manager, and I absolutely insisted upon it before we went into a meeting with ATO. And when he came out afterwards, he went, that was the best thing. It's like, okay, Lowy, that's great. So that's where I think that you know, it's different situations, different frequency, but it's again trying to encourage a continuous improvement and an honesty. Because if you ask your staff, did you think it went well? You know, don't kind of be too leading. Try and draw it out of them. Then they feel really good about that. They feel good, and you feel good because they're able to actually tell you. And often I'll actually designate someone in a particular meeting group that can be either the scribe or the person that actually gives the feedback afterwards. So my final tip, just while we're at it, so let's assume that this meeting that I'm talking about, let's say it is with the tax office. What I would do is I'll actually assign someone to take notes, and I'll also task them with trying to see what the ATO or the other party has written on their notes. Because one of those little tricks that I was taught many years ago in terms of meetings is try and see what the other party is actually thinking. And I had a real world example of this back in May because I had to go in and brief a board member of a company board. And I thought I was in big trouble because I sat down and he was pretty casual and he just kind of had his notes open and it basically had something like, however he'd written it, my interpretation was, this is a crock. Now, as it transpired, that was not quite what he meant. He had some other issue. But straight away, I was changing my approach with how I managed that meeting because I'd read upside down, seen what he'd written, and was thinking about, okay, so that's where we're going to end up, is it? And that's, again, it's just a practice that I think is healthy and makes for better business.
Absolutely. I think as finance leaders, we're always influencing someone, and to be able to understand the audience is really important. But look, we've run out of time. We've hit the 1:30 mark, and certainly I think today, for everyone in the room and everyone online would agree that we've just been able to hear some very, very powerful and influential insight around how leaders think and how an experienced CFO has attacked problems. And hopefully you're able to take some of that away and utilise that in your own role as a leader, as a finance professional, and in emerging your career. So I want to say thank you very much to you, Stewart.
It's a pleasure, Brad.
No worries. I appreciate you coming in. For everyone in the room and everyone online, round of applause.